guys, it's Courtney. Today we are going to be making a one-layer card with the Holiday Home stamp set by Miss Ink Stamps. You can see that I've already cut out a mask for my image. This is one large image, pretty easy to cut out, and I cut that from Simon Says Stamp masking paper. I'm also taking another large piece of masking paper here, and I'm going to cut little strips, and these are all 1/4 of an inch long, and I'm going to be masking out all 4 sides of my card panel to kind of give a little bit of a border. So I'm going to use my Mini Misty here to go ahead and stamp my image because it is such a large image, and I want to make sure that I really get a bold black outline for it. So I am going to be stamping on a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm going to be using Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink, of course. So like I said, I did end up stamping this twice just to make sure that I get that really bold outline. And then I'm going to go ahead and mask this out with that Simon Says Stamp masking paper. Now, because this is such a large image, it can be a little difficult to line up, even though the lines are pretty easy and for the most part straight. So I would suggest that if you're masking out something like this, you start with more of an intricate area. So I'm starting off with the side where that large tree is and making sure that that's lined up. Once that's lined up, the rest will pretty much fall into place, for the most part anyway. So once that was done, I'm going to go ahead and take those little strips that I've already cut out with more of that Simon Says Stamp masking paper, and I'm just going to go along the edges of my card panel. So I'm lining these up the best I can, making sure that the bottom edge of the masking paper meets the bottom edge of the card panel itself. And I'm kind of just leaving a little bit off to the side, and this helps it stick down while I do my ink blending. That's totally optional, but for me, that makes it a little bit easier so I don't necessarily have to hold down the panel as much and leave fingerprints where I don't want them to be. So once everything was masked out, we are going to do just a little bit of ink blending to add some color to the background. I'm going to be using Weathered Wood Distress Oxide ink and a Blending Buddy brush by Trinity Stamps to add just a little bit of color. So this is a kind of a grayish with maybe a hint of blue in it, but I didn't have a regular gray. I wanted everything to be kind of gray tones. So I'm just going to use one color here. I'm not doing a whole lot of blending, but I want this to kind of fade to white, I guess you could say. So I'm going to start off with the top. I have a piece of Post-it note tape that I've masked out the bottom portion just so that I don't go beyond that. So my darkest area for the top portion is going to be the very top. So I'm dabbing off my blending brush a couple of times on my scrap piece of paper so that I don't go in with too much of a heavy hand and I don't have really, really dark color. I want this to be fairly subtle. And I want this to kind of fade down to white. Now my mask for my tree, probably because I stuck it down too many times, lost a little bit of that tackiness and started to come up in those more intricate areas. In this particular case, I'm not too concerned about it because I'm going to be coloring directly over it and I'm using such a minimal amount of ink, it's really not going to make too much of a difference. So you can see here that I'm slowly building up my color. I'm kind of twisting and turning my card panel there to make sure that everything is even. Sometimes looking at it at a different angle will help out to see where you maybe need to add a little bit more ink or where you need to blend a little bit more. And like I said, I'm kind of fading off to white as I reach that strip of Post-it note tape that I have there. So once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and remove that Post-it note tape and then mask out the top that we just did our ink blending on. And I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending on the bottom the same way with the same color, only this time I'm starting from the bottom. And I want to add a really small amount here. And I realized the mask for the little walkway there, I guess it would be sidewalk, walkway, was not cut perfectly. So I ended up trimming that off and I'm just going to do my ink blending directly over it. Like I said, we're adding such a minimal amount of ink that you probably won't have a problem coloring directly over it. Normally, I would not recommend coloring over Distress Oxides, but in this case, being we're using such a little amount, I didn't really have a problem. So again, just concentrating that darkest area being towards the bottom of the panel and kind of fading up to somewhat white, I guess you could say, so that there's a differentiation between the sky and the snow. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully remove all of my masks. Normally I would wait until my Distress Oxide is dry, but in this case, like I said, we just used a little amount. I didn't have a problem removing the masks right away. I do use my scissors to kind of get the larger mask started so that I don't tear my paper when I'm removing that. So we're going to be using all gray tones. I'm going to be using the same markers for the entire image with the exception of the Christmas tree. I'm just going to be using different amounts, or maybe my darkest color won't always be the C7. So I'm starting off with the large tree, and I'm adding some flick lines where the different little sections of the tree are, I guess. So this would cast a shadow. The top section would cast a shadow on the bottom section. So I'm just adding a little bit of my darkest color there. And then I'm going to bring in my C5, and I'm just going to extend these flicks out a little bit further. Now in this case, I'm using all of the C markers with the exception of the C00, and that way you'll get a nice variation in color. Now I'm pretty much going to do the same thing for this entire card with the same color combination. But whenever you're using the same color combination for the entire image, you're going to want to pick a light source. With this tree, it really doesn't matter because it's going to have shadows where one section or one branch is hanging over another. But for the most part, you're going to want to make sure that your shadows are in the right spot so that you don't have two shadows directly next to one another. I'm just going to choose the top right-hand corner as my light source. We don't necessarily have one as far as a sun or a moon or anything like that, so you can pick anything you want. So wherever your light source is, your shadows are going to be in the opposite direction. So if your light source is in the top right, your shadows are going to be to the bottom left. So for these little, I guess these little plants, I don't know what they are, in front of the house, I'm going to add my shading to the left-hand side, keeping that highlight to the right. And this will kind of make sense as you go along because we're using the same colors. I don't want one C7 being right next to another C7 because you're not going to be able to tell where one image ends and where one begins. So for these other little bushes here, I'm not really adding a light source. I'm just adding little C marks to kind of give this a little bit of texture. And I'm just using the 3 different colors here. And there is texture within the illustration of the stamp itself. So you can just kind of follow that, or you can make your own like I did. So next, once that was done, we are going to move on to the fence. And I wanted this to look a little bit more white, so a little bit lighter than the trees. So I'm going to start off with my C5. I'm skipping the C7. And again, I'm going to add the shading to the left-hand side of each one of these fence posts. Also, I'm adding a little bit of a shadow underneath this little wreath, just because that would cast a shadow on the fence itself. I'm going to go ahead and blend that out with the C3. Now these are really teeny tiny areas, so you may want to just use 2 or 3 colors here. In this case, I did use 4, but I kind of lost my contrast because there's such a teeny tiny area. I was going over the darkest area with my lightest color, which tends to kind of make that dark color go away. So once I had all my colors down, I'm going to go back in with that C5 and just add a little bit more of a shadow, but I'm not going to blend it out. The paper's already wet. I already have all my colors down. So this is naturally going to blend a little bit anyway. So next we're going to move on to these, I guess they're stones maybe, on the chimney. Again, we have a top right light source. Our shadows are going to be to the bottom left. So for my C7, I'm only adding it to the left-hand side of each one of these stones, blending that out with the C5, and then finishing off with the C3 towards the right. I'm going to do the same thing for this little walkway, the stones on the walkway. I'm just adding those shadows or that darkest color to the left-hand side and a little bit towards the bottom part of what we can see anyway of these little stones. So going to blend that out a little bit with that C5 and the C3. Then we are going to move on to the house itself. So I don't want this to be as dark as the trees around it and as the walkway. I want the house to be kind of the star of the show. So I'm going to lighten it up a little bit by just adding a few shadows and not going quite as dark. So I'm not going to be using the C7 for most of the house anyway. So I'm going in and adding a shadow where the roof would be hanging over the house a little bit. So pretty much over the entire thing. Now the left-hand side of the house has siding and the other half is kind of like a brick. So I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow underneath each one of those little pieces of siding. I'm sure there's a technical term for that, but I don't know what it is. I'm also adding a shadow on the left-hand side of the door and on the bottom and the left of those windows. So my darkest color, like I said, was the C5, and then I'm going to go in with the C3, and I'm going to extend all of these shadows out. Now, you'll also see that normally, if you've ever watched my videos before, I typically go in with my lightest color to get everything mapped out and to also get the paper saturated. The more saturated the paper is, the more likely your colors are going to blend nicely. However, I don't feel the need to do that with grays. Typically with especially the cool grays, they tend to blend very nicely together, and there's really not too much of mapping out as far as the shadows go on this card because they're pretty self-explanatory. So I didn't go in with my lightest color first on anything, I don't think. So I'm going to finish off with the C00, which is one step above a colorless blender. It's very, very light. So my house is going to be extremely light because I want this to pop out. All of the darker things are going to be kind of in the background, I guess you could say. So for the little bricks that we have on the house themselves, I wanted these to stand out a little bit. So I am going to add my C7 and C5 to these. And again, just adding a little bit of that darker color off to the left-hand side. And then I'll blend that out with the C5 towards the right. I'm also adding a little bit of shading to the roof, to the left-hand side, and also where that roof is kind of bent in the shape of the house underneath the chimney. That would also be a little bit darker there as well. So I'm going to extend those areas out with the C5. For the roof itself, I am going to bring in the C3 and the C1. And there's two little parts of the roof. So there's like a thicker line and then a really, really thin line. And initially I was just going to leave that thin line white because honestly it's so teeny tiny you probably wouldn't notice the difference. But I did end up adding just a little bit of shading. And like I said, you could certainly leave this white and it wouldn't make a bit of a difference. So I am also going to add some shading to the rest of the walkway as well as the rest of the chimney there on the outside or in between those little rocks, I guess. And just concentrating that shading being off to the left-hand side once again. Now for the door, I'm going to use my grays again. I'm going to color in the door frame as well as those little sections, I guess you could say, within the door, those little rectangles that are inside the door. Those would be a little bit darker too because they would be indented. So I'm going to use my C7 and C5 for those areas. I think I brought in the C3 as well. And then for the door itself, I'm going to go in a little bit lighter just so that these areas kind of stand out from one another. Like I said, we are using the same colors over and over and over. So you just want to make sure that whatever object is next to another, you're using either a different combination or you're using a different amount. So if you're just going to use a flick or two of that scary dark color, which is in my case, a C7, the object next to it, maybe you want to use a little bit more, just to make sure that they do look different. So I'm just going to finish off with this little porch here. And then I wanted a pop of color. So obviously we have a whole bunch of gray going on and I wanted something to stand out. And I figured the Christmas tree in the window as well as the wreath that is hanging on the fence would be two objects that I would want a little pop of color. So I'm going to bring in some greens. And again, I am going to go right in with my darkest color first, and this will kind of keep that texture. And also, I don't want to oversaturate the paper at this point. If I oversaturate the paper and my colors end up bleeding at all, there's going to be no way I'm going to be able to take that up, especially with the dark colors that I'm using for the tree. So I'm doing the shading the same way as I did that other tree, just adding a little bit of shading underneath each one of those sections. I am trying to be careful not to go directly over those little ornaments. I'm not going to do any shading on these ornaments. They are really teeny tiny. So I am just going to bring in my R29, which is a fairly dark red, and just fill those in solid. I'm pretty much going to do the same thing for the wreath that is on the fence. I am just going to add my shading to the left-hand side. So there's obviously, well, there's a hole in the middle. So I'm going to add my shading to the left-hand side of the left side of the wreath, and also the left-hand side of the little opening, I guess you could say. So I'm adding shading in two different areas. And then again, using that R29 just to add those little berries on that wreath. So once my coloring was all done, we are going to go ahead and add our sentiment, and I'm using two different sentiments from this same stamp set. I'm just using the grid lines on my work surface here to make sure that those sentiments are lined up perfectly before popping those onto an acrylic block. I'm going to use black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp, and I did stamp this off onto a scrap piece of paper just to make sure that it is lined up before stamping that onto my card, and I just used the backing of the mask that I ended up using on the card. Once that was looking good, I went ahead and stamped that directly onto my card, and here is where I drop the top of my ink. And I did, it's hard to see on camera, but I did leave a little smudge on the top. So I'm going to add some snow with my white gel pen, and I'm adding all different size dots. Some I'm just popping down the tip of the marker or tip of the pen, and others I'm making those dots a little bit larger, and I'm covering up the entire panel with the exception of the snow that's on the ground. So I'm going directly over my images, especially in the darker areas, so that these snowflakes really pop out. I also took a EK Success journaling pen just to go over the little smoke that's coming out of the chimney, just because we went over this with our Distress Oxides, which are opaque. So they kind of muted that a little bit, and I wanted that to pop out a little bit more. And finally added a little bit of shimmer to the Christmas tree and wreath with a Nuvo Aqua shimmer pen. And that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.